The essence of consciousness is that we stand for Eros, and Eros stands against suffering, right? Anti-value inflicts suffering. Value goes to heal suffering. That's an objective reality. And that is the story of reality. It's the story of anti-value that goes to cause suffering, and the story of value that goes to heal suffering and create wholeness. That is the great story. That is the great value of reality. And that's where we have to all agree. That's where we have to all come together. And I think we can. And I know we will. So I'm actually crazy excited to talk to y'all today. So I'm just so grateful to be here. And we have 3 steps that we're going to do. Okay. The first step is, in a certain sense, I wouldn't say it's the least important, but it's not evergreen in the sense of it's kind of something that's going on now and there are implications for it. But I just want to, just because we're a close, intimate band of outrageous lovers and Da Vinci activists trying to respond to the meta crisis with this new story of value, which is so desperate, in our kind of international Florentine Platonic Academy, right? The reenactment of the academy that was in the Renaissance that birthed modernity. But we're also kind of this very just, close group of people that we're holding this together, and we get together here in one mountain every week. And by the way, if this is your first One Mountain, how many people are here for a first One Mountain? I'm feeling responsible now. Show of hands, first One Mountain. Who's here for the first time? Anybody? Okay, so you just bear with us, okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, so a couple of things. And we have like 3 distinct parts. The second 2 are we have to kind of change the world with them, and they're insanely important. And I want to say kind of encounter to blame. Actually, when I was talking to Lena on Thursday night, there was a particular moment where she got something. There was a glow went off in her eyes about part. I'm going to talk about that today, which made me very happy, right? Because it actually will create possibility. That's really important. I'm going to share that with you today as well. But first, let me get to part 1. But here's part 1. So I want to just share with you a little bit. So we just launched a podcast this week in response to my friend and colleague, although we haven't met, Yuval Harari. And I want to be just kind of very precise about what we've done, why we've done it, and how we're going to proceed, right? Because we did it with a lot of care and love, and precision. And it's gotten, I don't know, Aubrey called me yesterday, Aubrey Marcus, and he said it's gotten, I don't know, about in the different channels about 130, 140,000 people have kind of tuned in and begun to get a sense of this. So it's a beginning, and it's insanely important. So I'm going to say just, 4 or 5 things. 1, the reason we're doing it has nothing to do with Yuval himself. I take it as a premise that Yuval is a decent, good, wonderful man who actually cares about humanity, in a deep and a profound way. Okay? I want to kind of just start there. That's 1. 2, when someone says, quote, any meaning that people ascribe to their lives is mere delusion, and by delusion, a word that he uses repetitively, he means insane, meaning it's part of a kind of a mental breakdown. That's what delusion, means in the dictionary. Right? There are no inherent goals that make any sense. There's no value that is true. There is no meaning. And Yuval, in case we got it wrong, italicizes the word any, meaning none whatsoever. Number 1, that's kind of claim 1. And claim 2 is, right, all stories are wrong. It's not that some stories are better than other stories. The idea of story is ridiculous, absurd, preposterous, completely contrived. And anytime you say something about a story in response to any question, you're wrong. Okay? So those are kind of the 2, premises. And they're quite well hidden. They're consistent positions throughout Yuval's work. right? It's layered, however, deep in his writing. His writing is actually filled with insight about technology, which is important. In general, historical insight of certain kinds that is partially important and partially nihilistic, kind of hidden nihilism that kind of moves through all of his writing. And essentially, no one will really take it on for lots of reasons. And one is that Yuval's deeply embedded in the power structures of reality. And so he's very much a Goliath. He's got, 20 full-time people kind of running and footnoting and working and kind of, aligning him with the power structures of reality, from the World Economic Forum, to the Davos group, to, Bill Gates and, that institutional world, or the Mark Zuckerberg institutional world, right? Yuval's kind of become very much a spokesperson for this world, which he kind of, faintly criticizes, but actually aligns with in the core structure of how he thinks and articulates the world. Now, I'm not going to enter into the Yuval conversation. I've given this year probably 15, 20 talks on this, so I don't want to go down that road. That's not my point now. Right? It just needed doing, right? We needed to speak it clearly. But in speaking it clearly, right, and we did that in the podcast, and I would invite anyone who'd like to listen, be very, very helpful to people to listen, to kind of helping move this kind of into the world. And if you'd like to comment, if you'd like to share it, all those things matter an enormous amount. But I'm mentioning it here for three reasons. One is I wrote a long letter to Yuval. Personally, I couldn't kind of figure out exactly how to get it to him. So in the end, I wrote it in 10 direct messages from Instagram, from our Insta at the center, which I didn't even know it was called Insta, and I'd never actually looked at it. Krista's been kind of running it and moving it in the world. So Aubrey told me that you can do a DM. I didn't know what a DM was, a direct message from one Insta to another. So I wrote a long, careful message, letter, of a few pages to Yuval, thanking him because he actually helped my son in Israel at a certain point when my son was doing some work, and just appreciating him, and also explaining, what the motivation, was. So that's the first thing. I send them this letter and I invited either a public conversation or a private conversation. Let's have dinner and let's talk before the podcast went up. And in all of the public talks I've given, I've invited that conversation as well. But I sent a direct personal letter. Second, there's been some invective on the thread, which is demonizing of Yuval. And something like, Yuval's a scum, a sociopath, this kind of an intense demonization of Yuval. That's not okay. That's not okay. That's not how we have a conversation. We have a conversation. We unsheath our sword, strength and honor. We stand for value, right? We're willing to thrust and parry, but with honor, with dignity, with goodness, with respect. And so I asked Krista, and Krista very, very, lovingly, took some extra time. And anytime someone posted on the thread a demonizing remark about Yuval, I posted a strong objection and explained exactly why we don't have a conversation that way. I don't think it's true, but I'm sure Yuval's a decent, good, and wonderful man, number one. Number two, we have to learn how to have a conversation. And I don't think, to be clear, I don't have a sense that on these core issues is meaning completely meaninglessness, right? In other words, is Yuval right? Any meaning we ascribe to our lives is mere delusion? No, I don't think that's right in any sense, shape, or form. I don't feel a sense that, wow, Yuval and I are having different perspectives on the same issue and we should split the difference and there's some, equivalence between our perspectives. No, I don't think any of that. I think I'm right and he's wrong in a very fundamental way. And I have no trouble saying that. Having said that, I have to honor my adversary, A, And B, I understand where he's coming. I understand what he's reading. I can feel in my body what he's feeling, right? And that's a much longer conversation, which we did. I spent an entire Sunday morning, some of you may recall, where we talked about the experience of the void, the experience of emptiness, the experience of a world devoid of value, and that experience is a real experience. And it doesn't come from sickness, and it doesn't come from some demonized scum. It's actually a genuine experience which reality intended to be a possibility. Did everyone catch that? It's a genuine experience which reality intended to be a possibility. And it's not an experience only of those people, not those people over there. They have it. I have it. There's moments when I have it, where I feel it, where I feel the void arising and there's no words that can be spoken. Right? And that's when we sit in silence. That's when we chant. That's when we play, right? There's ways to access value. And so I don't want to go down that road either. My only point is that it's not okay. Even if you think you're entirely right, you have to actually feel the depth of where your genuine interlocutor, even if they're an adversary, is emerging from. You have to actually be able to feel it in yourself, and then respond to it powerfully with honor, with respect, but not a respect that makes the way you articulate tepid or banal. It's not like, for example, the early dialogues between Jews and Christians in the early 1960s. After Christianity has spent a couple of thousand years saying the Jews killed Christ and organized pogrom after pogrom, and then Jews and Christians started talking, and everyone was very careful. And as one could remark about those early Jewish Christian dialogues, it was when Jews who didn't believe in Judaism, got together with Christians who didn't believe in Christianity, and they discovered they had a lot in common, right? So there wasn't a real conversation. There wasn't a fierce contestation. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not some kind of, woke, nonviolent communication, right? No. It's a fierce contestation. Swords are raised, but swords are raised with honor. Swords are raised with respect. Swords are raised with love, with an open heart, right? And so we have to be really, really fierce, right? But being fierce and tender at the same time, right? And so I just want to kind of add that, one, we wanted to have a fierce conversation. Two, I wrote Yuval before a long and deep personal letter, inviting, a deeper engagement. Three, I have great honor for Yuval, and we'll kind of stand fiercely against, the kind of demonization that appears in some threads in his regard. There's no place for it at all. Because those are the 3 points I wanted to make. And maybe the fourth, and this is just to share with us intimately, kind of tenderly. Okay. So you might notice there was a certain tone to it, which was a little bit fierce. And cheers. So the reason for the fierce tone, and, was fierce, and I mean, maybe a little bit funny. I hope it was a little bit funny, but, I didn't go in with the intention to be funny. It's just, we laughed because we want to just kind of open the space. And I wanted to make sure, and again, none of this was thought through before. It's just what happened in the moment. But I wanted to make sure that, just in my body, not my mind, that the things that were said that were fierce weren't mean. Does everyone get that distinction between fierce and mean? And playful because we're playing. We're playing seriously. We're playing seriously, but we don't want to, devolve into a kind of meanness. So it was fierce, but hopefully, kind of on the inside of the inside together, and kind of inviting that kind of, direct engagement. Okay, so enough on that. Was this helpful, everyone? I wanted to share kind of, with our internal, kind of intimate circle, to give you a sense of the kind of, wider, and broader context, right? So you can kind of, get a sense of it. Okay. And anyone who hasn't seen it yet, right? Take a look, right? It'd be kind of crazy helpful, and, share it wherever you can. And maybe I'll just add one thing. and this might seem a little bit unbelievable, but it's actually not, which is, and I won't go into kind of how this works, and because I don't exactly know how it works, but we know that there's a process that happens with YouTube, which is called shadow banning. And shadow banning is when, a piece of material is found kind of offensive, violating kind of, I would say kind of mainstream, politically correct, positions, and it gets shadow banned, meaning it's not taken off, but it'll kind of burst. It'll get a whole bunch of views. Then the views will almost stop. So I don't want to violate confidentiality, but I've spoken to a number of people in the last days, and one person who did a very particular podcast with a prominent figure, and it kind of hit, 80,000 views just in the first, short amount of time, and then it just stopped, like 5 views a day. So it was shadow banned. Right now, how shadow banning works in terms of the algorithms is a whole conversation, and normally I don't track things like views. So for example, in One Mountain, we're intentionally doing a small community. There's about, probably in our One Mountain community, about 3,000-4,000 people. And, a couple hundred of us get together, kind of every week, and, a few hundred views. And we intentionally have built it this way till now, and because we want to have an intimate, small community where we can be together and articulate the next steps of the great library. And it's not built on kind of premises of marketing. It's not even built on this kind of intention to grow. It's built on deepening. All right. Sometimes when people want to, when we're chanting, we want to intensify the chant, people start going faster. But instead, we should go deeper. So our One Mountain principle, for example, is not about numbers at all. It's this kind of revolutionary moment. It's about going deeper together. So I rarely mention things like numbers. I've avoided them. When I was in the Middle East, I did a show, which was kind of like some version of the kind of spiritual Oprah show in the country. And it became kind of the number one show of its genre, in terms of ratings and things. But, I told the staff that I would not look at ratings until the season was over. I didn't want to know the numbers. I didn't want to respond to the numbers. But I'm gonna talk numbers for a second, therefore, for a particular reason now, okay? Which is the following. So the first 24 hours when the podcast launched, which was only 3.5 days ago, right? It got about, I'll tell you exactly, it got 15,150 views, about 15,200 views, something like that. And then basically, so it burst, right? And Krista got all sorts of, indications from the algorithmic structures that it was kind of outperforming, by 70%, all that kind of stuff. So we're pleased that people were receiving it. And then basically it stopped, right? When I say basically it stopped, it didn't completely stop. But in other words, based on the algorithmic predictions that, Aubrey and everyone had, it should have kept kind of growing in a certain kind of way. And it was very clear that there was an algorithmic shift. I won't waste your time why it was clear, but it was dead clear, right, that had happened, and that algorithmically it had gotten shadow banned, right? Did you notice that, Colin? Did you notice that? And all of a sudden, that's exactly what happened. It just, right? And then I checked, and it turned out that this had happened, right, to a number of key pieces in the same vector. It just flattened, right? That's shadow banning. And it was just to share with you, and I'm not going to waste your time with all the reasons we know that that's what happened, but that is what happened. But it's actually a little bit of a shocking experience. You realize that, there's not actually free channels of communication, and that something can get shadow banned. It's very, very hard to trace. And it was a very complex experience. I mean, I kind of felt into this happening for a day and a half, and it just made me sad. So I want to just ask everyone, because it's not showing up in people's feeds, right, in the way that it should. So it kind of this very complex, right, shadow banning is taking place through YouTube. So anything people can do, therefore, let's partner together, right? And we really want to work to, because in order for something, let me just explain why. In order for something to kind of be able to penetrate culture, you need some sense of energy around it. Now, it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful, but we want to try and bring it up over the next, couple of months. And we want to just create a kind of a solid community of not a crazy large community, but a solid community of, 50,000, 100,000 people who have kind of been in these ideas. And, but not just now, there's about 140, 150,000 people who have watched like the shorts. But I mean, people have really studied, we've really, 100,000 of us, 50,000 of us have actually studied the material together, in a serious way. And then we can begin sharing it. We can begin sharing it. And Parallax, the publishing group in Europe, they're going to take all of the conversations we had about Yuval and kind of edit them into a kind of, we call it Lena style oral essays book. So that's kind of in play and in process. So we'll try and do that. But it's very important this goes into the world. And I hope that it, in the end, reshapes something important. So anything that people can do now to just literally send it to your list, because we literally, I mean, this is not hyperbole, and this is not some sort of kind of strange conspiratorial, this is actually fact, right? It got shadow banned, so we have to bypass the algorithmic shadow ban. So I just want to invite everyone, just if you can, I'll do it myself, just share it with our list and ask people to watch. So if we can create a kind of, this dates me. I was 5 years old when this was happening, but I remember hearing about it in my parents' house, the 1968, whenever it was, the Eugene McCarthy campaign, right, for president, which was this very deep, beautiful kind of grassroots campaign. So I just want to really just invite everyone to this kind of grassroots kind of like sharing. Is that fair? Does that make sense, everybody? So yay. Okay. Was that just, let me just check in for a second. Now we're going to part 2. Was that helpful just to kind of get this kind of inside, kind of plug into kind of what's happening and, feel? And so I just want to, if I can, just to feel just how precise, and I'm sure we've gotten a lot of things wrong. I'm sure we did a lot of things wrong. So if you think we did 5 things wrong, you're probably right, but we've tried hard. And I think we're making mistakes in the right direction. And we've tried to operate with precision, right? With respect, with precision, with honor, with fierceness, with tenderness, right? We've tried our best not to be sloppy, right? So thank you. So we are in our 3rd week of talking about, and I'm going to ask beloved Jacqueline and Jamie and, Krista, Haley, let's, there was last week and the week before, let's call each one of them value and anti-value, story and anti-story, part 1 and part 2. And so this is going to be part 3, right? Value and anti-value, story and anti-story, part 3. So bear with me for a second, and we're doing entirely like this huge step forward. But I want to share with you just to start why I was excited when I talked to Lena on Thursday night. She had this, light in her eyes for a moment, not Lena, there's not generally light in her eyes, but it was just a particular amplification of the light. Right, which was like she got the significance in this very deep, subtle, nuanced way, which made me very happy, right, of why this move we're making, particularly in terms of story. I mean, story is an expression of the larger enactment of a story of value, emerging from a field of value, populated by inherent, eternal, and evolving first principles and first values, is so critical, but with particular emphasis in this conversation on story. if you can imagine what we're trying to do, and I've often used the image of the time between stories and time between worlds of the Renaissance, and I invoked already earlier today the Florentine Platonic Academy with Pico della Mirandola and Ficino and Da Vinci, which actually tells a new story that actually births modernity. And we've also said many times that to the extent that they got the news story right, they got the plot lines right, they burst the dignities of modernity. To the extent that in that time between worlds, that time between stories in the Renaissance, they got the plot line wrong, or they missed key parts of the plot line, they actually burst the disasters of modernity, which have now led to the meta crisis. We've said that many times, and there's a key essay called Love or Die, which should always be in the thread, which kind of gives some of this context. But I want, if I can, just to give you a somewhat different image, a tantric image, if you will. And the word tantra has multiple meanings in Sanskrit, but one of them is to weave. So a weaving image, or maybe not exactly weaving, more like stitching, right? We're tailors. We are tailors of Eros. Does that make sense? We are tailors of Eros. We're not spiritual teachers. We're artists. We're artists and we're tailors here. And this is the gathering of the tailors, right? We're tailors of Eros. We're weaving together. We're stitching together rips in the cosmos. And a cosmos that is torn asunder, a cosmos that is fragmented, a cosmos whose seams of value have been ripped apart. And the seams of value have been ripped apart because they were bursting at the seams, and they needed to be ripped apart in order to restitch the cosmos. They need to be ripped apart because they were hijacked by ethnocentric, anti-body, anti-sexuality, emasculating structures of medieval religion, who in their public forms inflicted enormous cruelty. Even as each system, each religion claimed exclusive access to the cloth of the fabric of value. And then they wove their dresses and their tunics and their garments, from a fabric of value which they claimed exclusively of theirs. But that fabric turned out not to be silken, but to be coarse and painful, right? And devastating on the human body, heart, and soul. So the seams, S-E-A-M-S, the seams, right, of the garment, of the levush, right, L-E-V-U-S-H, the levush, the garment of reality, right? Its garment of value had to be ripped apart. And now we're restitching it. And if we don't restitch it, then the emperor has no clothes. Then cosmos is denuded of value, and it rips apart. It rips apart not in heat death, but in heart death. Right? I'm not worried about heat death, not only because it's trillions of years away, because I don't think that's necessarily the way the world's going to go based on the science. The science has also become enormously dogmatic, but there's many responses we have to heat death trillions of years from now. Our issue is not heat death, it's heart death. It's the death of the fire of Eros, which is the fire of value, which is the lion of fire that lives in the sanctum sanctorum of the temple, which is the fire of value, right? Of meaning, of it's not just, let me just say it this way. It's not just that my friend Harari is wrong when he says any meaning that human beings ascribe to their lives is a mere delusion. I would say the opposite. Any meaning that the clarified heart of human beings ascribe to their lives is true, right? That's a genuine pluralism, not a deluded heart, right? Not a pathological heart, not a psychotic heart, but that's actually not what most hearts are, right? Any meaning articulated, right, through the clarified hearts of human beings in whatever system and whatever unique garments of intimacy that they weave are true. We have to restitch the cosmos, but we can't just declare it. We have to restitch, we have to reweave, because the garments of value have been torn apart. There's a tear in cosmos. So we need to redo and reformulate value theory, right? And for example, one of the reformulations of value theory is the realization that eternal and evolving value are not contradictory. There was a long comment on the thread, at some point, on this, of this podcast, whatever we did, which basically said, you're telling the silly new age story of eternal and evolving value. Everyone knows that's ridiculous. Everyone who's taken a couple of philosophy classes. Well, no, my friend, not exactly true. Right? The dogmatic assumption, right, of value theory is that value is eternal, and eternal means unchanging. No, that's not what eternal means. Eternal doesn't mean everlasting time. We've said this time and again. Eternal means underneath time, beneath space and time. There's a field of value in which space and time arise. And one of the qualities of value, this is so beautiful and so true, one of the qualities of value itself is transformation, is evolution. So non-dual reality, or kind of eternal existence, doesn't mean unchanging existence. It means a field of value populated by first principles and first values, which evolve because evolution itself is value. And when they evolve, it doesn't mean that there's no stable ground. The ground, for example, is Eros. And Eros means something. The experience of radical aliveness. That's the Eros interior science equation. The experience of radical aliveness, a desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness, which itself is ever greater value. That is the eternity of Eros, and that eternity of Eros evolves. Of course. Now, when we say it evolves, we're saying there's a story. Do you get that, everybody? In other words, evolution means story. There's no split between the word evolution and story. Does that make sense? If you just had eternity, then eternity could be either static or it could be round and round again we go, right? We keep going, right? And that's what Mircea Eliade, the academic researcher, right, in describing some of the expressions of the religions of the East, particular religions, he talked about their mainstream position being a myth of eternal return, right? An eternal circle, right, that you never get off of, right? This cycle that you can't get off the wheel. This myth of eternal return, that goes on virtually ad infinitum. And this is not about interpreting particular traditions, but that's a base of eternity. So eternity either means it's static, right? And there was a fundamental notion in Greek thought that actually it's about being spectator to all eternal time and existence, or a kind of Eastern notion of a myth of eternal return, but that's actually not sufficiently expressive of the ground of reality. The ground of reality is not merely eternal being. It's eternal being in the sense of a being, a ground that lies beneath time, and then eternal being gives birth to becoming, and becoming, which is the evolutionary movement of transformation, is always a story. That's the point. Evolution's not this accident that scientists happen to discover. Plotinus started talking about it, but, evolution and, the biosphere got real serious around Darwin's grandfather, who talks quite seriously about it, and as did other people. And Darwin did some of the important, experimental, right, collection work to kind of validate this notion of an evolving biosphere. Okay, but that's not, no. Evolution is so much more than that. Evolution is, as Abraham Cook points out, it's a value structure of cosmos. And the value structure of cosmos means cosmos is going somewhere. That's a story. There's a plot line. It's going somewhere. Okay, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. So there's eternity in evolution. Now, let's stay very close here. And it's very, very beautiful. And it gets more beautiful by the second. So the structure of reality is that reality is both eternal in the sense of value itself being the very ground of reality, and it's evolving. Reality is non-story, pure being, pure consciousness, and story, pure becoming, pure evolutionary unfolding. That's the nature of reality. And they both live in us, right? I mean, we often say that the sexual models the erotic. So I don't know. We actually invited this week only virgins on the call. So that was a special week. Krista, thank you for sending that out. So I don't know if some other people slip through. That happens sometimes, right? So I know that most of the people on the call are not familiar with this, but you could probably talk to other, One Mountain members and kind of, find out. But for those of you who have either read about or are familiar or maybe watched a movie which has sexuality in it, so you know that sexuality is a story, right? Sexing is a story, but it's going somewhere. Okay, now stay close for a second. What happens at the end of sexing? So at the end of sexing, there's this explosion in a particular kind of sexing. You can also do a sexing, which is the myth of eternal return, right? Which is a sexing, which is a kind of just staying in the space and in the energy, which is a beautiful kind of sexing. But in kind of what I'm going to call, I call that circle sexing. But in more classical sexing, which we might call line sexing, there's a trajectory, there's a plot line, right? It's going somewhere, right? There's a movement. And all of the elements of story that we're about to unfold all actually express themselves in the story of sexing. And we'll get to that. But then you may have noticed that after the crescendoed explosion, right, in which, on a good day, one touches heaven, and somehow there's this very beautiful notion of touching heaven together, right, which can be very beautiful. Not our conversation for today. What happens afterwards? So in the movie, either she gets up to smoke a cigarette, turns over and goes to sleep, or he gets up to smoke a cigarette, or he's quickly on his phone, or she's on her phone, or they're kind of fidgeting, and they're not sure what to do with themselves, because what do you do after you've called God's name, after you've screamed the name of God, right? Sexing is divinity in motion, screaming the name of God. What do you do after you've seen God's name? Smoke a cigarette, right? What do you do? So actually, what you do is, and I'm going to cite a Latin word. How many people here know Latin? Anyone here know Latin? Latin, okay, this is an original Latin word. Maybe it's not. I might be lying. I'm so sorry. I have a fever. But the word is cuddle. 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 Can someone put that in the chat box? Right? Cuddle. Anyone got that in the chat box? Chat box, anybody help me up? Give it in caps. Kirsten, give me some caps there, girl. Okay, Germany. Zohar, give me some. There we go. Okay. Now, what is cuddling? So cuddling is you've moved past becoming and you're now in being. Do you get that? In other words, there's this place of just being. We're not trying to, right? What the aftertaste should be is, it's very, very beautiful, is that after the movement of becoming, we then drop into being. Now, that's not a minor, that's not a blip. That's structural to reality. So if you read in Western esoteric literature, the single most important, what's called story of reality, it's called Maaseh Merkava, which literally means Maaseh, M-A, like apostrophe, A-S-E-H, Maaseh, which means the account of, right? Lena, you wrote me about the story being an account of. So Maaseh means the account of. And it's very, very important. Okay, stay close. The account of. The account of means the story of. Now stay close. So account means the account of, it's the account of the chariot. It's the story of the chariot, which is called the story of reality. So there's two great esoteric mysteries. And one's called Maaseh Merkabah, the account of, or the story of the chariot, which lives in two prophets, Ezekiel and Isaiah, two masters. And the second kind of body of the mysteries is Maaseh Bereshit, which is the account of creation, or the account of Genesis, or the story, Maaseh, the story of Genesis. Now stay close. So the word account is counting. I'm an accountant. Okay, good Jewish boys become accountants, not rabbis. Okay, I'm an accountant. I count. What does an accountant mean? So one is I'm counting, and two is it counts, means it matters. So reality is not matter, we've said before. Reality is also it matters, because reality counts. It counts means it's significant. It's not just a story. It counts. Now, in the original Hebrew, the word for number, right? You count with a number. The word for number is mispar, M-I-S-P-A-R, right? I count, mispar. In other languages that came to English, you would call it a cipher. And the same root word is also sipur, S-I-P-P-U-R, which is story. Now stay close. Stay close, stay close, stay close, stay close, stay close, okay? So Krista, Talia, help me out here in the chat box. So we've got the Maaseh Merkabah, the account, or the story. So for example, Hasidic stories are called a maisa. A maisa is the same word, a maaseh. It's a deed, but it's not a deed, it's an account. It's an account, right? Maasiot, right? Accounts of masters, stories of masters. So a maaseh is an account, which is a story. Because what the story means is there's an account, there's a plot line, there's a structure, and that story is significant, it counts. Right? Because reality is constituted by number and story. And what number means is that there's a structure, there's a pattern to reality. What number means is that reality is already suffused with value. And the first form of value that suffuses reality is mathematical value. And mathematical value is the story of numbers, right? Right. So reality is number, which is value, which is why you have mathematical value. And mathematical value, right, is a particular quality of cosmos, just like musical value is. Beethoven's fifth, da 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 da, right? A unique number, which is a unique value, which evokes a unique quality, which then merges with other qualities, which is the next part of Beethoven's fifth, which is unbelievable, the next 30 seconds, right? And number is also story. So an account is a story. So counting number is also an account in English, right? And again, right, now we have an example of how English and Hebrew play together in words. So in Hebrew, it's mispar, story. No, mispar, number. Mispar, number. And sipur, story. Are you with me in the chat box, everybody? Let's get these down. Don't go away. Mispar, number. Sipur, story. But this is, what am I sharing with you? I'm not sharing with you like, why is he talking Hebrew? Who cares about that? No. Language is the code of reality itself. I don't know if I've shared with anyone. I'm actually a linguist. I'm a world-class linguist. I was very involved in, linguistic conferences through the world. I actually revived myself a Siberian language. Did I ever share that with you? I might be lying. Okay, I didn't share that with you because it's not true. Lena did that. Sorry, I got a little confused there. Fever. Sorry. Okay, but language is a structure of reality. Did you get that? Language is an inherent code of reality that discloses meaning. So when you have, and there's certain languages which are kind of like original languages, that's a different conversation. Greek and Hebrew are both important, but different conversation. But all languages, in some sense, disclose something essential about reality. And we transmit languages through our body, right? How does a child learn language? It's this direct transmission that's happening of this enormously subtle and complex and nuanced code of value, right? That lives in language. So in language, we have an account. Let's go to English, which is a late language. An account, which is also a story. A ma'aseh, an account, which is also a story. And in Hebrew, right, we have a mispar and a number and a sipur story. And what we're saying is that the nature of reality is both, right, Platonic numbers, the eternity of Platonic numbers, and even mathematicians who are kind of materialists seem to become Platonists, meaning they talk about eternity, right, when they talk about numbers, right? In any number of mathematicians, I've read that over the years. So there's the sense of these eternal numbers, but eternal meaning it's a real structure of reality. But story is also a real structure of reality. And story means that when the unmanifest becomes manifest, it wants to unfold a story. There's a story that wants to unfold. There's a direction. There's action that's yearning to take place, that's yearning to emerge. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. Now, the action that's yearning to emerge is value. Okay, does that make sense, everyone? The action that's yearning to emerge is value. The action that stands against what's yearning to emerge is anti-value. So there's these two movements in reality, but they're not equal. Anti-value is part of the value story. Lucifer falls from heaven, right? So in other words, it's not that there's actually equal ontology to value and anti-value. There's value, but one of the mysteries of reality is that there's also anti-value. There is this great struggle in reality. There is both evolution, and then there's this, there's this enormous human wisdom. Humans are unimaginably wise, and humans also can be unimaginably stupid. Does that make sense? I mean, we all know that nuclear weapons are devastating, and yet we manufacture them. We all know, anyone who's really studied seriously artificial intelligence knows that there's a significant chance it could get away from us and could cause existential risk. And we are now involved in an AI arms race around the world, even though we know. So we are wise enough to generate AI and stupid enough, right, to have a race to the bottom because we can't figure out how to create agreements because of what we call multipolar traps. Human beings are complex. There's stupidity, but there's also anti-value. Anti-value, there's this movement towards destruction, towards deconstruction. And they both live in the world. And for example, The Lord of the Rings, the trilogy it became a movie trilogy, but this trilogy of books and of writings by Tolkien is about when these two stories meet each other. In other words, the hobbits of the Shire meet Sauron, right, in the Eye of Sauron. So Sauron is anti-value, right? And the hobbits of the Shire and Gandalf and Aragorn and Arwen, right, are value. So there's these two stories that meet each other, the story of value and the story of anti-value. That's very much the structure of reality. Okay? So I want to try and look at this. So let's see if we can kind of dive into this and take this one step further. Okay? Okay. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to take a little 60-second break. Okay? So story is a value structure of reality. Story is not just a story, right? Story is an inherent structure of reality. Just like you can't think about reality without space or time. Does that make sense? So there's no reality without story. And the way that the interior scientists talk about this, they say God loves stories. But what they mean is that this account of the chariot, which is the mystical story of reality, or the account of creation, Ma'aseh Merkava and Ma'aseh Bereshit, the account is both a counting, it's the mathematical structure of reality, and it's the storage structure of reality. And there's no split between the mathematical and the storage structure of reality. Story is the mathematics of reality's story, of reality's unfolding. Story is the mathematics of reality's becoming. There is no reality without story. There is no manifest world without story. You know, I don't want to go down this road, but I think you could also say there's no language without story. Okay? That you can't actually split story and language. That in some sense they're inherently intertwined and intertwisted. Okay, but I'll leave that to the linguists. I'll leave that to Lena and friends. Now, so let's go slow. So reality's value. One of the first principles and first values of reality is story. That's two. Everyone with me? And then a story is always a story of value. Or said differently, we're going to see this in a second. Story is always reality moving towards more value. That's always the plot line of a story. Now, within every story, there's two movements. And every story has many plots and subplots, right? So there's kind of an overarching storyline, and then there's all sorts of, right? Lena, the way you said it, all sorts of sub-stories within the story. A story is always it's one overarching storyline with, billions of subplots or 10 subplots, okay? So within every story, there's another story happening, which is the anti-story. Does that make sense? Within every movement towards value, there's a resistance to that movement, which is anti-value. And you can feel resistance. It doesn't feel good. When I'm talking to someone and I feel resistance, I try and let's find our way through. That's anti-value. Resistance is almost always anti-value. That doesn't mean we surrender. We can be fierce and autonomous. But there's something else. There's a quality of resistance to value, which is anti-value, and resistance to value in the end goes to try and destroy values. That's its nature. And if we can, again, let's just use as our model, Lord of the Rings. There's a movement towards value, which we're going to see, we're going to talk about, and then there's this movement of anti-value. So one of the great dimensions, or one of the great's not the right word, one of the inherent dimensions of every story is that it's a story of value, that it's moving towards value, that its plot line is this movement towards ever greater wholeness, which itself is more value. That's what wholeness is. Wholeness is more value, right? Subatomic particles become an atom. They become more whole. There's more value. Does everyone get this? Do you get how opposite this is of saying stories are just made up? No stories are real. Stories don't matter. Stories, right? No. No, stories in an inherent structure of a reality in which meaning is not hard to find. Meaning is impossible to avoid. Right? So we're in the, literally, we're doing this Da Vinci revolution. We're in the very source code and the heat heart of reality itself. So in story, which is a story of value, there's a subplot, which is an anti-story, which is anti-value. Does that make sense? Okay. Which is why in Lord of the Rings, what do we have? We have this movement towards value, and then we have this anti-value movement happening at the same time. So there's always value and anti-value. And there's always eros and anti-eros. And there's always you and anti-you. And there's always story and anti-story. Okay, that's always how it works. Okay? And as I shared this with my dear beloved initiate student, friend, partner, Aubrey, he picked up on the self dimension of this, right? The you anti-you, he named it you anti-you as an expression. We were talking about value and anti-value, and he applied it to you. And he's focusing, kind of like as his expression in the Great Library, he's focusing on this kind of thinking and feeling into the kind of the way of telling the story through the prism of you and anti-you, which is very beautiful and important and gorgeous. So now stay close. It gets crazy good in terms of its beauty. So what are the elements of story? Okay. So there are 6 elements to story that live in story all the way down and all the way up the evolutionary chain. Okay. Now again, we all know the kind of core structure, right? It's almost like a sutra, a mantra. Do we have any English words here we could use? It's almost like give me an English word. Why are we using this thing? So I love sutra and mantra. It's beautiful, but what would be a good English word? It's a I don't know. What's a good English word for sutra and mantra? Help me out. Hebrew word, French word? Give me something. Help me out. So there's it's not a chant. It's not a pasuk. It's not a verse, but it's close. It's a chorus. It's a refrain. A refrain? How's a refrain? Okay, right? Right. So there's a kind of refrain, but it's like a refrain of verse, right? It's kind of like a sacred text in cosmologic humanism where we say, and we can all say it with me, right? We say reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story. Reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story. Reality is an evolutionary love story. Reality is an outrageous love story. And an outrageous love story is not a Pollyannish love story. Rather, an outrageous love story embraces the full agony and ecstasy of life. And finally, your story, my story, is a chapter, a verse in the universal love story. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the structure. That's the core structure, okay? So here we go. That's the core structure. So now what are the elements of story? So this notion of story has to work. It's true all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain, meaning it's true at the level of subatomic particles, and it's true at the level of molecular biology, right? And it's true at the level of organismic reality, and it's true at the level of hominids on the savannah. It's true at the level of humans and at every developmental level of human consciousness, right? Good? Okay. So 1, let's see if we can do this, okay? So 1. So, and maybe just let me just try and say it simply. When people say things like, human subjectivity would not be missed, right, in the cosmos if we weren't here. And human subjectivity, of course, means something like love. And you say that as a function of saying that, love as an inherent value of cosmos. There are no inherent values to cosmos, right? Love is just as B.F. Skinner says, or Alex Pentland or Harari, as it's but Skinner's language, it's but a positive reinforcer, right? And Pentland articulates pretty much the same way. And Harari, in his own language, follows in their wake. You're like, huh. I mean, if the world is filled with love songs across space and time, right? That tells you something. That tells you that reality is coded with love. And our experience of love is not an artificial artifact. We live and die for love, right? And as love is not merely a survival mechanism, we're ready to give up our lives for love, which is the opposite of survival. So we love, right? And we have not only individual selection in evolution, we have what's called group selection, which my friend Howard Bloom did the original major work on. Right? And David Sloan Wilson, who's a kind of more formal academic, actually appropriately credited Howard in the introduction to his book with cracking open into society group selection. Group selection means, right, I don't just want me to survive, I want my community to survive, and I'm willing to give up me for the sake of the community because love is real, because my love of the community is real. And because I have the sense that there's a larger communion, and I also have the sense as I meet the edge of life, I don't enter into oblivion. I enter into a door between two worlds, right? Death is a night between 2 days. And so therefore group selection is this inherent altruism, that lives across space and time, this inherent love. Altruism is a fancy name used in the literature to cover up, right, for the word love. Love is an inherent in the structure of evolutionary reality, right? And if you look at, Darwin's descent, Darwin talks, all over the place, every other page about beauty and about love. So reality is filled with love songs, and reality is filled with stories. And reality is filled with love stories. And so reality is love songs, love stories, stories. So reality is filled with stories, not because we're trying to make sense of a blind reality and creating an artificial story arc. Reality is filled with stories because reality is a story. That's its nature. Okay? Its nature is a story. That's its very nature. Its nature is a story. Okay? So stay close. Stay close. Okay? So the first element of story, what's the first element of story? So the first element of story is that there's always, I'm going to do this very, very quickly in just like 7 minutes. The first element of story is that there's a threaded causal action. Right? In other words, action is taken, and action leads to another action. But that's what a story means. And an action affects the next step. Now you understand that that is at the very core of what I would call the dignity of reality. Reality is not dignified if action doesn't have result. Right? If there's this constant divine interference in reality, deus machina, right? In other words, it only appears like, and many of the great religions made this argument. Mystics, they said, no, there really is no action. There's actually a constant divine intervention, right? That's called constant creation. In Islamic thought, in Christian thought, in Hebraic thought, this notion that there only appears to be nature, but actually there's constant creation. There's this stepping in every second of divinity. Now, it's not that that's wrong. What the erotic mystics of the great religions were saying, right, is that the world's not a clock that was wound up by a clockmaker who then went away. That there's this radical intimacy. It's an intimate universe, and there's a pouring in every second. That's true. Everyone with me, stay very close. That's true. There's this sense of this complete, we're sustained, we're poured into, right? We are breathed into. Kol man denafach midilei nafach, writes the Zohar. Right? In every second, I'm breathed into this in-breath and this out-breath. So I can feel her breathing me. We're one breath with the infinite intimate. And at the same time, there's also a set of causal actions in the world. Because if the lover is so close to us in one breath, then we don't have any autonomy. We only have intimacy. We only have allurement. We have no autonomy. We have no dignity. And dignity is my capacity to take action. So a story means that one action leads to another action, that there's an inherent plot line. And in the manifest world, divinity allows actions to actually affect one another and to create a threaded set of events in which there's a causal connection, right, between different events. Does everyone get that? So it's not, right, because it's deep, right? It's deep. Does everyone get, just give me a show of hands. Does everyone get that? That's the first element of story. That's the first element of story. It's a very deep element, okay? So in the first element of story, is there's a threading of action, and that threading is real. The threading is not an illusion. Does everyone get that? Threading is not an illusion. It's not, oh, it looks like that's happening, but really divinity's stepping in every second and making the action happen. And actually, right, the participation in the threaded action is but an illusion and irrelevant. And your job as a human being is to see through that and to realize there was never any action. No, that's not correct. And that position that I'm rejecting is adopted by the mysticisms of most major traditions. That's not correct. We're saying, no, there's dignity to story. There's a narrative arc to reality. Reality is stories within stories within stories. There's an overarching story, and then it's stories within stories within stories within stories within stories. And there's a dignity to those stories. And the dignity of story comes from the ability of one action to affect another action. Does everyone get that? Without that, there's no dignity. There's no dignity. Again, dignity is a value of cosmos. Dignity is a value of cosmos. Dignity means in Hebrew kavod, K-A-V-O-D, kavod. And kavod means weighty, right? Like, like when we say, wow, that was a heavy song. Heavy means weighty. It has gravitas, it has gravity, right? It's not the unbearable lightness of being. There's a gravitas. So gravitas is dignity, right? My life matters. Right? Matter is filled with what matters, right? Matter itself is not merely static eternity. Matter itself is telling a story, which is why the Hebrew word for davar, we've said it 1,000 times, for thing is also word. And word is language, and language is the telling of a story. So there's not just matter, there's story. Matter is what matters, which is value, and value is the plot line of every story. It's very interesting. I was tracing with my dear friend Art, who's a Hebraic scholar, right? And we were studying a particular text, and we were tracing the word chayfetz. And I thank Talia for doing some beautiful research on this, right? And chayfetz is in Hebrew means, and later in Aramaic, it's cheftza, which means an object. But the original kind of Hebrew is chafetz, and chafetz means desire. So the original word is desire, chafetz in the original Hebrew. And then in, 120 instances of it, or 119, right, it's always desire. But then what the language does is it moves to the desire becomes then an object of desire. So desire is now an object of desire. Then desire falls away and you have just object. Right? So in modern Hebrew, the word chayfetz, right, is an object. Literally means chafatzim, means my property, my furniture. Chafatzai, objects. So it went from desire to object of desire to object. That's exactly the movement of this disenchantment of reality. I don't realize that the object is alive. The object is filled with desire. The object is filled with yearning. One of the things that beloved KK, Christina, my beloved wife and partner, right, gets is the livingness of an object. So, for example, in the house here, really the prince of the house is the cat, just to be clear. Boots gets, pretty much most of the attention. There was a couple of people coming up here just to kind of help take care of some things, and they said to me that KK spent about 90 seconds talking to them about how to take care of me while I was working, and about 20 minutes talking about Boots. So I understand. I got this. So Boots is number one in the house. Number two is the objects, right? Is the objects, right? Right? KK has a very deep and beautiful sense of a livingness of an object, right? Which is not an attachment, but she has a sense of kind of the quality of the object, right? Whether it's family heirlooms or whether it's, a particular piece of something, right? And so, right. And of course, Lena's painting hangs right next to and above the mantle. And the mantle was carefully chosen. So KK has a sense of this living nature of objects, right? And by the way, I'm number 3 in the house. I'm number 3, right? But I'm happy being number 3. I'm happy they even let me stay here, right? Like that Boots and the furniture and KK let me stay. It's already like a really good day. Okay, but you get that, right? So there's this sense in which, right, the things are alive. Right? There's a story to everything, right? So the essential structure of reality is that there's these threaded events, and the threaded events is one thing affects another thing, but not just on the human level, And on the subatomic level, on the atomic level, one thing affects another thing, which affects another thing. There's a threaded causality, and that threaded causality is part of I'm going to call it the dignity of existence. Or let's call it, can I give it another name? Let's call it the dignity of finitude. Is that good, everybody? The dignity of finitude. So number two, the second element, right? The second element of every story is desire, right? And not what is being desired, but desire itself. There's a quality of desire. So every chayfetz, every object is filled with desire. So not just the object is an object of desire, the object itself is filled with desire. So I have here a glass in front of me. The glass itself is a molecular dance of subatomic particles. It's got leptons and hadrons, right? Quarks, whatever that configuration means. It's a network of relationships that are filled with desire that hold it together, and we call it a glass. That is literally scientifically true, right? So the chayfetz, the object, is actually a dancing cacophony of desire. So that's true all the way down. All of reality is animated by desire. So the second element is not what I'm desiring, it's the element and the quality of chayfetz, of desire itself. Chayfetz, object, means desire, right? Davar, thing, means word, right? So that's the second element. That's desire. And that is the quality of desire. So the first dignity of reality is threaded causal action. And the second dignity of reality is the dignity of desire. Then the third element, right, is what Christina Alman was talking about, right, in the Dharma recapitulation that we said last week. Reality is not only an is, it's also an ought. It's also a should. There's a plot line. And a plot line means there's a telos. There's a place we're trying to get, right? There's not just a path. There's also a destiny. There's also a destination. And that's value. So the plot line of reality is value. And what we call in cosmologic humanism, this new story of value, what we call the first principles and first values of reality, those are the plot lines of reality. Okay? So those are plot lines. That's three. And let's recapitulate these first three in just literally one sentence, right? Now, reality is story, and the story is a story of desire, and the desire is a desire for value. Everyone get that? Reality is story. The story is a story of desire, and the desire is the desire for value. Those are the first three elements. The fourth element is, and this is related to the dignity in the first element, there's some dimension of first person. I am present in it. There's an I, but the I is not just Kirsten. It's not just Krista. It's not just Talia, right? The I is the I, the first person. There's some dimension of first person. It doesn't mean that a subatomic particle experiences itself as Brett and Nietzsche. It's not like two, there's not like a nuclei of a kind of proton-neutron, right? That's Brent, and then Nietzsche's an electron, and they kind of right? That's not how it works. But there's a proto-first person. There's a proto kind of sense of proto-awareness, and that point's been made by Richard Feynman, the physicist. It's made by all the interior sciences. It's made by Stuart Kauffman, right? Now, there's lots of reasons. There's Whitehead calls it, the mathematician calls it prehension, a kind of proto-interiority, a proto-awareness. Because that's the fourth element of story, right? And of course, there's an evolution of all these elements. There's an evolution of our ability, right, to articulate value. There's an evolution, a clarification of our desire. There's an evolution of higher and higher levels of freedom. Okay. The fifth element of story is what I'm going to call the arc of the story. Now, the arc of the story is not just crisis. As Teilhard de Chardin talked about this notion of the crisis birth, and Barbara echoed it from de Chardin, our friend Barbara Marx Hubbard. The notion of our crisis is a birth is a phrase of de Chardin's, or some version of that, of Teilhard's. Right, that actually one of the things that happens in the arc of reality, there's a crisis, and that crisis causes a jump to a higher level. Right, our crisis is a birth. A crisis is an evolutionary driver. That's just one expression of it, though. The fifth element of story is a little different. It's that in a story you have intensifications, and this would take an hour to explain this fully, but just in a word, there's an intensification. So it's not always a crisis. So let's say two people love each other. Okay, let's say two people love each other. And then that love intensifies. Does that make sense? The love intensifies. And then what happens? The tenderness intensifies, the depth intensifies. And that intensification causes a next emergence, a next stage in the story, a next evolution of the storyline. So there's an intensification. And the intensification births, right, the next stage of the story. Right? That's the fifth element of story. And the final element of story, right, is this notion of story is not just caused by the past. Story emerges out of the depth of my presence in the present. And I'm just going to move away from the sun. Story emerges out of the depth of my presence in the present, right? And story is also driven by the call of the future. So it's not just my yesterday that drives me. It's my tomorrow that calls me. It's not just I need to go to a therapist to recover the memory and work out the memories of my past. But if I'm truly in a new level of relationship, which is called the whole mate, so the whole itself calls me. And the whole calls me from the future. There's the call of my future self, right? The arc of our relationship, the arc of my story is called forth by what? By my future self, right? By tomorrow. Tomorrow calls me. The memory of the future calls me. That's the sixth element of story, right? That in the story, in my story, I'm both completely defined by yesterday. I need to access and recover my memories and live them always ever deeper, because memory is not static, right? That's one of the things that memory theorists have pointed out, that memory is Eric Kandel, right? Did enormously important work on memory, right? Memory, Eric points out, Kandel points out, is constantly evolving. Memory is not static. That's why you can have false memories. But I've got to work with the memory. And there's false memories in an extreme version, but I can actually refine my memory. I deepen my memory. So memory itself of yesterday evolves. And then there's the depth of the present, if you will, the memory of the present, the inside of the presence, right, which lives in the present, which actually impregnates the moment, right, which is why eternity, right, and evolution reside in the depths of what Whitehead calls the occasion, right, of the moment. Then I'm called by the future. As Nachman of Breslov, right, the great Hasidic master, points out, I wake up and I'm called by a memory of the future. And the first thing that Nachman says that I do when I wake up in the morning is Zichron Alma Da'ati in Aramaic. I remember my future. So that's the sixth element of story. Now, let's take a look at this. How does this work? Let's take a look just for 10 seconds. Let's take a look at the story of, Lord of the Rings. How does it work? So in Lord of the Rings, what do you have? You have in Tolkien's epic, you have a threaded action, right? So someone does something, and that which they do affects the next piece of action. So there's a sense of Gandalf will, ride to the Shire, right? And he will tell, let's say, Frodo, right, that one of the 9 ghost kings that have been empowered by Sauron, right, are coming to kill Frodo because they've captured Gollum and they've tortured him. And Gollum was the bearer of the ring, right? And Gollum said 2 words, right? In his torture, he said something like hobbits and Shire, or Bilbo and Shire, some 2 words, I don't remember what they were, right? But 2 words that they were able to, right? And these 9 riders are coming to kill Frodo, and Gandalf kind of, right? Lions and tigers and bears, right? Shire and Baggins. Thank you, Timothy Pollarier. But those are the 2 words. And Gandalf comes to alert Frodo. So Gandalf, right, alerting Frodo, right, is an action. Right. And that action then causes the next stage of action. Right. And that happens all through. There's the sense of the dignity of human action. Right. Actions and strategies are taken. And there are the strategies of Gandalf, Gandalf the Grey, who's going to actually die in the second movie and be resurrected as Gandalf the White. But there's this set of actions that are taken for the sake of defending Middle-earth and for the sake of value. And then there's Sauron, who's the corrupt, arch power, king, right? Who forges these 9 rings and then a final ring, which is the ring of power, in which he actually invests. He actually invests himself in the object. It's the chayfetz. Does everyone get that? So in other words, let me just make this general point. All through the Lord of the Rings, there's this assumption that an object, in this case, the ring, is filled with desire. Does that make sense? The ring, the object, is not just an object, but it's a chayfetz. It's an object that's filled with desire. I mean, the ring is alive. That the ring has energy. There is no matter. There's always a story. The ring is always going somewhere. It always has a yearning. It has a longing. And it's so powerful it actually overtakes you. Right? But the point is that all of reality has desire. Right? And there's the desire for value. Right? And the desire for value is in some sense what we might call second simplicity, which is why the expressors of the desire for value are the hobbits in the Shire. And Sam wants to marry, what's her name? Help me, Mary? What's her name? Who does he want to marry? Who does Sam want to marry? He saw her dance, and he goes and marries her at the end of the third movie. And he thinks about her when he's about to die, when Frodo asks him, what's her name? No, not Samantha. Thanks, Alexander, but that was a good try. What's her name? Oh God, I can't remember her name. But someone will remember her name at some point. But in any case, the desire for value is simple. It's not a desire for power for its own sake. It's the desire to love. It's the desire to Rosie. That's Rosie. That's right. It's Rosie, right? It's the desire to break bread together. It's the desire for art and for creativity and for music and for beauty and for relationship and for depth of conversation and for healing. Right. And for it's a second simplicity, right, of desire, which fills. These are the kind of the desires that are so whole and so beautiful and so obvious and so stunning, right, which fill the Shire. Right. And the Shire are not these righteous people. The Shire are the most beautiful of people. They're the common folk, right, at their most beautiful. Does that make sense, everybody? So there's the desire of the Shire, and then there's the desire of Sauron. So you've got you have all 6 elements. You have threaded action. Sauron is all about threaded action, right? He'll do something which will cause something else, which will cause something else, which will cause something else. There's a plot line, right? And if there wasn't a plot line, it would be a mechanical manual, right? So the point is that there's a set of actions which one action causes the next action. That's number one. Number 2, there's desire. There's desire. There's the desire of anti-value, which is moving in one direction, which is this overweening and overpowering desire of Sauron for pure power for its own sake. Right? It's power for its own sake. Right? So just like in the Shire, there's desire of Sauron. And the desire of Sauron is for its own sake. And the desire in the Shire is for its own sake. So Sam wants to dance with Rosie Cotton. Why? For its own sake. Right? Frodo and Sam love each other and they're deep and dear friends. Why? For its own sake. Right? Bilbo, right? Frodo's uncle, right? He loves to adventure, but for its own sake. Right? And he managed in the power of his desire, Bilbo, Frodo's uncle, for its own sake, is so beautiful and so pristine and so pure that the ring actually can't quite get a hold of him. Bilbo's so powerful that he manages to receive the ring. He knows the ring is seductive, but his desire for simplicity, second simplicity and goodness, is so powerful that the ring actually can't get a hold of him. Isn't that shocking? So there's desire for value, for the second simplicity. It's desire for its own sake. Friendship, food, music, art, dance, community for its own sake. And then there's, right, Sauron's desire, which is for raw, pure power for its own sake. That's the second element. So the third element, it's a desire for value. So the desire of the Shire, of Gandalf, right, of Aragorn, of Arwen, right, it's desire for value, right? Sauron, and then he seduces Saruman, and they generate the orcs. It's desire for anti-value. But you got to get it to an actual desire, right? And then let's take a look here for a second. And then we have the fourth element of story, right? The fourth element of story, which is, let's take a look at it for a second. Right? The fourth element of story is this sense of freedom, right? You have the sense of freedom. In other words, the whole point, what the elf Gadriel, how do you pronounce his name? Galadriel? Give me the pronunciation, somebody. Pronunciation of the elf queen that kind of takes care of Frodo and Sam and tells Frodo about his mission, right? No. Give me Galadriel. Is it Galadriel? Okay, Galadriel. Okay, good. Right. So Galadriel, what she says to Frodo is she talks to him about being free, about his choice. Galadriel, thank you. She talks to him about his choice and about his freedom and about what he has to do. Right. There's this enormous sense, right, that Frodo has to choose. Right. He has to choose. And there's this set of choices, Boromir, right, whose father is the corrupt kind of regent because there's no king, because Aragorn hasn't gone back and claimed the throne of Gondor. So Boromir's father is acting as the regent, and Boromir is kind of overcome. He tries to take the ring until he kind of tries to take the ring. And Galadriel had warned, right, Frodo that someone was going to try and take the ring. And then Boromir kind of captures his deeper self and finds himself, right, and finds his heart and gives the ring, right, support, comes back to support Frodo, and then dies, right, defending Frodo and Sam. There's this constant sense of choice. Saruman also chooses, but he chooses for Sauron. So all through the story, right, there's these sets of choices that need to be made. It's not inexorable. There's a first-person, powerful sense of freedom in the story. Then the fifth element of story is there's this arc, there's this intensification. There's both, and you actually feel, at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, there's this feeling of there's this intensification of evil, this intensification of anti-value. People feel anti-value is on the move. And that intensification then causes an eruption. And in the same sense, that's one intensification, right, of kind of this intensification that happens through the bond between Sauron and Saruman and the orcs. But then there's this opposite intensification, which is when Elrond gathers the dwarves, right, and the men and the elves, right, and they come together and they form the Fellowship of the Ring. There's this intensification of the fellowship of Merv and Pippin and Gimli, right? And, the dwarf and the elf, right? There's this intensification of love. There's this incredible scene where, what's his name? Legolas, right? So Gimli and Legolas, you've got the dwarf and the this warrior dwarf and warrior elf, and they're about to attack Mordor, right? Because Strider, who's actually Aragorn, who's the true king, has decided to attack directly Mordor in order to shift the eye of Sauron to their attack so that Frodo and Sam will be able to get to Mount Doom and throw the ring and destroy the ring. Right? Remember, that's the action. And so it looks like they have no way of winning the battle. And the dwarf says to the elf, he says, God, who would have thought I'm going to, stand here and kind of die fighting, next to an elf. And he responds to him, right? The elven warrior says, I'm proud to die standing next to a friend, right? And there's this intensification of love between the dwarfs and the elves that happens, let's say, through that particular relationship. So there's these intensifications of love between Merv and Pippin, between Frodo and Sam, right? These constant intensifications of love that actually cause, right, this deepening of action, these intensifications of eros, these intensifications of relationship that cause the next stages of action. So there's this movement. That's the fifth element of story. The fifth element of story is, one is crisis is a birth. So crisis generates the next stage of action. But two, it's not only crisis, there's also intensifications of value, of eros value, and intensifications of anti-eros value that cause the next stage of action. And finally, there's past, present, and future. There's the treaties of the past that need to be honored, right? There's the alliance between dwarves and men. There's the ghosts who have given their word, right, to stand for the heir, right, to the throne of Gondor, which turns out to be Aragorn. And he invites the ghosts to come fight, right, at the key battle of Helm's Deep, and then they're released. So they're loyal to the past. There's the depth of love and possibility in the present. And then there's the call of the future, right? That they're imagining. There's a moment when Galadriel, right, shows Frodo what Middle Earth will look like if Sauron is triumphant. So that's one future. And Gandalf is holding a vision of a different future, of a Middle Earth that's at peace. So they're called by the future. So the plot line is defined by the present, the memory of the past, and the memory of the future. So these six elements play across all stories. There's no stories that don't play across, right? They're always in play. In our personal lives and our collective lives, they're in play all the way down the evolutionary chain, right? So when we talk about, for example, subatomic particles becoming an atom, it's the same thing. You've got these threaded events, right? You have kind of the play of proton and neutron, which form the nuclei, and the play of electrons. And they're clearly in a cosmos of number, in a cosmos of matter, where one event affects another event, number one. Number two, there's a desire. There's an allurement, 380,000 years after the Big Bang. Number three, there's an allurement for value, and the new value is an atom, right? Number four, right, there's a dimension of aliveness, of freedom at play, what Whitehead calls prehension, right? It's not just mechanical. There's this aliveness, right, at play, right? And number five, right, the intensification of allurement, right, forces at some point this bursting forth that comes together that creates the new wholeness, which is an atom. And of course, right, we're called into, we're called by the future, which is the atom. That's actually the memory of the future that's calling the proton and neutron and the nuclei and then the electron to come together, right, in the depth of the present. And of course, they're driven by all of the yesterdays. So, wow, right? Wow. Okay, so these are the elements of story. And once we get that, and this is the last sentence. Thank you, everyone. That once we get that our stories are dignified. Reality is a story. And my story, and this is the reason we did all of this, because I'm living my story. And the great command of life is live your story. But live your story is not meaningless. It's not a false ascription of meaning, right? It's not a kind of social construction, as Harari says. It's not your story's meaning as a figment of your imagination. You take responsibility for your story. You're captain of your destiny. And yes, everything's acting upon you. Yes, there's all these forces that you can't control. And yet within all of that which is beyond me, there's this dimension in which I actually step into the fullness of my story. I move from being a victim to a player, and I become the hero of my own story. And that's infinitely valuable. And my story is part of your story. My story is never alone. No story lives alone. Every story is chapter and verse in the universal love story. And that is the dignity of cosmos itself. The dignity of cosmos is the dignity of story. And that's at the heart of the revolution. There is no room for anything else. Right? When we actually degrade the dignity of story, and this is the paradox, even if we talk about value all the time. So my friend Yuval talks about, but he's trying to figure out how to do good shit all the time. Of course he is, right? But when you don't have a ground of value, when you don't have a field of value, then as C.S. Lewis, points out in his book written in 1943 called The Abolition of Man, written in the middle of World War II as 12,000 people were being gassed a day in Auschwitz. C.S. Lewis says, in the first generation of omnicompetent, controllers, people will still talk about value. They'll have undermined the reality of value, but they'll keep talking about it. And they may be good people. And that'll work for a generation, maybe a generation and a half. Then it'll be gone. Because if you destroy the plot line, you destroy humanity. Right? The joy, the response to suffering, and maybe this is the last thing. The essence of consciousness is that we stand for Eros, and Eros stands against suffering. Right? Anti-value inflicts suffering. Value goes to heal suffering. That's an objective reality. And that is the story of reality. It's the story of anti-value that goes to cause suffering, and the story of value that goes to heal suffering and create wholeness. That is the great story. That is the great value of reality. And that's where we have to all agree. That's where we have to all come together. And I think we can. And I know we will. Okay. Thank you, everybody. All right, what a crazy pleasure and joy. Krista.
Crazy, crazy, crazy pleasure and joy. Marc Gafni, amazing how you just keep on going and going and going, even though you're feeling sick today. I just also want to thank everyone here for staying in, for giving your attention. As I always say, it matters so much that we're here and that we're holding this. Marc beautifully shared, I think earlier this week, maybe it was last Sunday, I don't remember, but the way that we place our attention is so important. It actually changes the field and the fabric of the field, and it changes whatever she is pouring through Marc in that moment. So we actually do have a seat at the table of history. I think David wrote in the chat earlier, like, wow, I just can't believe the privilege to be here. The other thing we mentioned is this book, First Principles and First Values. I think it's mirrored, strangely enough. But it's on Amazon, and please do buy it. Please read it, study it, drink it, become it, and take a moment to go to Amazon to leave your review. This is super important to get that book out into the world. And finally, we are going to get together in only a few months. It's been a long, long winter without each other, but we actually get to spend some time in person again. Marc spoke so beautifully about the need to cuddle after great sexing. So we'll get to do some cuddling, some dancing, some embodied presence with each other. And that's so, so important to fuel this revolution. And of course, we get to study the Dharma in so much more depth together. So make sure that you sign up by going to erosmysteryschool.com. If you have any questions, reach out to Shahat. She would be very, very happy to speak to you and to help you. I just can't wait to see each other there.